But this case was never about damages in the sense of compensation. It was about damages in the sense of forcing change. It was about damages in the sense of realizing the goals of these families to do whatever they can to help prevent the next Sandy Hook.
It's been 10 years since a gunman armed with a Remington assault rifle murdered his mother and 20 elementary school children in Connecticut. Now, an unprecedented $73 million ruling against Remington, the oldest gun manufacturer in the U.S., could end the industry's long-standing immunity. Hello, I'm Rida Fakhri. Welcome to the program. The United States is mired in endemic gun violence. There have been more than 1,300 school shootings in the country since 1970. More Americans died of gun violence in 2020 than any other year on record. And in 2021, there was more than one mass shooting a day. Now, there are more guns in private hands in the US than people. In fact, the US has the highest per capita gun ownership in the world, with around 121 firearms in circulation for every 100 residents. The US is also the largest manufacturer and exporter of guns in the world. And until last week's landmark judgment, American gun manufacturers have almost entirely avoided legal responsibility for how their weapons have been marketed, sold, or used. This is due to the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, the PLCAA. Passed by Congress in 2005, it provides broad protections for gun manufacturers against legal liabilities for how their weapons are used. The law coincided with the expiration of a 10-year assault weapons ban in the US, enacted in 1994. Attempts to challenge the PLCAA and reinstate the assault weapons ban have thus far failed. Recent polls suggest that just over 50% of Americans support stricter gun laws, and half of those surveyed agreed there should be a nationwide ban on assault weapons. Joining me now is Sari Kaufman, a survivor of the shooting at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, that killed 17 students in 2018. Now a student at Yale University, she's a vocal activist for stricter gun laws. Sari Kaufman, as a survivor of an absolutely horrific school shooting 4 years ago, I cannot begin to imagine just how painful and traumatic it must have been for you when 17 of your classmates, school friends, and teachers were murdered by gunmen. Yet you've been one of the most vocal advocates for gun safety ever since. Are you beginning to see some glimmers of hope? How much of a moral victory was it for you and others to see the Remington settlement? What difference do you think it will make in preventing the next Parkland shooting?
Yeah, I think it was definitely a huge victory for gun violence prevention. Whenever we can hold these gun manufacturers accountable, it is important because it's just one of the steps to preventing gun violence and specifically these school shootings. So especially after coming back to school and seeing desks empty in my classrooms because some of my friends passed away in the shooting, and now seeing that a gun manufacturer in Sandy Hook was held accountable, I now have hope that the gun manufacturer of Parkland, Smith & Wesson, is now held accountable too.
How much will significant change depend on holding these gun manufacturers accountable? How much of it will depend on a significant shift in public opinion that will force policy action at the state and federal level?
Yeah, well, right now, a lot of the public supports background checks and red flag laws. More than 90% of Americans support background checks on the federal level. So there's a lot of public support for gun violence prevention policies that need to be passed on the federal and state level, but then also holding the private corporations accountable. I think both of those are going to be great ways to decrease gun violence, not just school shootings, but even everyday gun violence, suicides, and unintentional shootings.
But are we seeing significant enough change, though? Because in 2018, after the shooting at your school, support for gun control was at its highest level. In fact, 66% of Americans supported new gun control legislation back then. Now, more Americans than ever before are buying guns. In fact, millions of Americans became first-time gun owners during the pandemic. Are you surprised that in 2022, according to a new poll, over 60% of Americans support enforcing current gun laws instead of passing new, stricter gun control laws?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that more Americans did buy guns in 2022, and I think people need to understand the risks of having a gun in the house, and especially because school shootings, a lot of times the students get their guns. 76% of the students get guns from the home, so making sure that parents are keeping their guns secure and storing them correctly is going to be really important as more Americans are buying guns.
And the statistics are absolutely startling. Close to 50,000 people have died of gun violence since President Biden has been in office. It's one of the many startling facts on US firearm deaths in the last year. Why is it getting so out of control, and how do you stop it? Because the president has called on Congress to pass new gun control legislation. But as we know, Democrats don't seem to be interested. The midterms are around the corner. Why isn't there enough political support for gun control? And what would you tell President Biden and lawmakers on Capitol Hill if you met them?
Well, I think there's a lot that these lawmakers can do, and President Biden has signed executive orders, and he can continue to sign executive orders helping to decrease gun violence. And it's really important, especially as we go into midterms, that voters are aware of electing gun sense champions and making sure that even on the local level, even on the school board level, that's one of the gun violence, that we are electing the correct lawmakers who support gun reform. Because after experiencing the shooting, I understand how devastating it is, not just on that day, but all the impacts afterwards. So it's important that the public is aware of that when they go into the midterm elections, and that President Biden and Congress continue to push for gun safety legislation.
Thank you so much, Sari Kaufman, for taking the time to speak to me. I know just how painful this issue still is for you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Despite efforts by gun control activists like Sari Kaufman to enact stricter laws and force policy action by the US government and the Congress, the pro-gun lobby remains highly influential. But could the historic multi-million-dollar settlement against a leading US gun manufacturer be a game changer? Does the Second Amendment of the US Constitution that guarantees the right to bear arms and several laws passed at the state and federal levels protect gun makers and offer them legal immunity from prosecution? Joining me now is Dave Workman, Communications Director with the Second Amendment Foundation, an organization that supports gun rights. Dave Workman, we just heard from one of the young survivors of a mass school shooting in Florida in 2018, where an AR-15 assault weapon was used to gun down 17 students and teachers. Now, Remington, the maker of that AR-15 rifle, which was also used in another school shooting at Sandy Hook about 10 years ago, has been forced to pay $73 million as a result of the lawsuit brought by the families of 9 of the 26 victims of that shooting. Many gun control, gun safety advocates are hopeful that the gun industry will finally face legal liability for promoting the sale of these weapons. Is this long overdue?
Well, no, and I think we need to clarify something. Remington, which no longer exists as a corporate entity, didn't make any arrangement at all. It was 4 insurance companies that represented the former company. The insurance companies settled. Remington isn't even around anymore to settle. So, that's a myth, I think, that's being created by people to give the impression that the firearms industry somehow settled this lawsuit, and the firearms industry didn't do any such thing.
But even if Remington no longer exists, and it has gone bankrupt in the last few years, what the settlement has done is prove that even with the strong special protections in place, gun manufacturers can and will be held accountable, that guns are being marketed in irresponsible, some would say unlawful ways to troubled young men who end up committing some of these massacres. Do you agree?
No, I don't. I don't see how this particular case has any impact at all on the firearms industry. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act is still fully intact. It's still the law of the land. I know that Joe Biden would like to have it repealed. He's probably going to get a pretty hard fight over that on Capitol Hill. He hasn't been able to move that ahead so far. As far as
But hold on, even if that is the case, though, Dave Workman, I mean, clearly what we've seen in this case is that gun manufacturers and the financial institutions that facilitate some of the work they do is being taken to task. I mean, President Biden himself said this about the settlement. He said, while it does not erase the pain, it does begin the necessary work of holding gun manufacturers accountable for manufacturing weapons of war and irresponsibly marketing these firearms. I mean, the reality is that these gun makers are putting profits above any other consideration. Why shouldn't the gun industry as a whole be exposed to more scrutiny like every other industry?
well, the firearms industry is still liable for defective products, and it can be sued for turning out products that simply don't work or that cause injuries that they knew through defective production.
Well, we're not talking about defective products. We're talking about these assault weapons being used to murder school children.
Well, look, you're turning this into an argument that doesn't have a resolution. If you would step back from the gun, just forget guns for a minute. Apply the same logic to the automobile industry here or in Great Britain or anywhere. Say somebody, a third party, steals a car and runs over a bunch of people. Are you going to sue the car manufacturer? That makes no sense at all. And that's really why all of industry is paying attention to this. In the firearm really.
But that isn't the same, though, is it?
Well, it's the issue.
What this lawsuit accused Remington, and by extension the gun industry, is that it is marketing some of these weapons that are designed for battlefields to young people, troubled young people who shouldn't be anywhere close to them. I mean, for years there's been zero accountability. No liability.
Another mistake here. The firearm that we're talking about was not designed for the battlefield at all. It may look like it, but that's not a military firearm at all. And as far as the marketing, remember that the shooter at Sandy Hook did not buy that firearm. His mother bought that firearm. And I don't think marketing to a 20-year-old male is going to affect her at all. He murdered his own mother to steal that firearm and go down to the school. She was the first victim. And I think that gets lost in all of this rhetoric. He murdered his own mother to get access to her firearms to commit that horrible crime.
He did, and however awful that isn't the key issue, though, is it? You say that the AR-15 isn't an assault weapon designed for the battlefield, but it's an indisputable fact, isn't it, that it is a semi-automatic assault weapon that is used on the battlefield. According to one of its designers, in fact, the AR-15 rifle was engineered to create, quote, maximum wound effect. AR-15s were used in 6 out of the 10 deadliest mass shootings in the last decade. They have become the go-to weapons for people who commit these crimes.
Well, and before the AR-15, they called the handgun the go-to weapon. We're not talking about people who want to take action against a particular firearm. We're talking about a movement in the United States to ban the private possession of all firearms. They're just picking the low-hanging fruit right now. The AR-15, and I don't own one. I've never owned one. The AR-15 is a semi-automatic rifle. It looks like a military weapon, but it is not a military weapon. It uses pretty much the same ammunition as a military firearm.
It's a semi-automatic assault weapon. Well, the U.S. Army's own field manual, Mr. Workman says.
There is no such thing as a semi-automatic assault weapon.
What is it then?
It does not exist. An assault weapon is a selective fire weapon. You can fire full or semi-automatic. Usually it's full automatic or a 3-shot burst. You can't do that with an AR-15 or any other commercially available civilian version. You simply can't do that.
What would you call this rifle then? What would you call it? How would you describe it?
Well, it's a modern sporting rifle for all intents and purposes.
But that is a term that has been coined by one of the lobby groups, in fact, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, many years
Well,
ago.
the-
Whatever you
okay,
call it doesn't change the
the
facts.
term assault weapon was coined by the gun control lobby.
All right. It's a debate that will have to go on now. But for now, though, thank you so much for your time and insights. Dave Workman, appreciate it. Thank you. Now, America's endemic gun violence isn't confined to the US. It also bleeds across the border to Mexico and other countries. According to data collected by the US government, around 70% of firearms recovered each year by Mexican authorities can be traced back to the United States. Mexico has seen a significant increase in gun violence and homicides since the expiration of the US assault weapons ban in 2004. Last August, the Mexican government filed a lawsuit in US federal court against 10 US gun manufacturers seeking $10 billion in damages. The suit accuses those manufacturers of knowingly profiting from the illegal sale of military-grade weapons in Mexico, quote, particularly of the military-style assault weapons favored by the drug cartels. I'm now joined by Hector Balderas, the Attorney General of the U.S. state of New Mexico. He is one of 13 state U.S. attorneys general who have signed an amicus brief in support of Mexico's lawsuit. Attorney General Balderas, looking at the recent settlement between Remington and the families of the victims of a school shooting in the United States, quite unprecedented, quite historic. How do you expect it, if at all, to have an impact on the way that private US gun companies are being held accountable or not moving forward for the way they market their weapons and facilitate, whether it is directly or not, the trafficking of these weapons across the US's borders to countries like Mexico, where they're being used by criminals and drug lords to fuel the growing violence in that country?
Well, truly the settlement and some of the litigation decisions that led up to the settlement really is a game changer in terms of giving extra rights to consumers, safety advocates, and more importantly, it really gives states an ability to defend its own people and enforce public safety values in our own marketplace.
Do you expect this will be a wake-up call, not just for the powerful US gun industry and its influential lobby here in the US, but also for the banking and insurance companies that prop it up as well?
Absolutely. In terms of risk mitigation and assessing liability, I think all of these companies who profit off of these war weapons really now have to think twice in terms of whether or not the profits are really worth the risks. That now they have to be accountable to consumers and they have to be accountable to law enforcement agencies and governments that are really footing the bill, the public safety bill that is left behind when these sales lead to horrific damages in our state and across this country and even internationally.
And the question is, will they be held accountable from this point on? I mean, the Mexican lawsuit, which takes on 10 US gun manufacturers and which you and several other attorney generals have supported, tries to hold these companies accountable. Until now, though, the industry has had full immunity from litigation. It has so far operated with almost complete impunity. Is the power and the influence of the gun lobby, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, which has pushed states in the US and the federal government to enact laws that would protect these gun makers, beginning to wane? I mean, is this really a game changer?
It really is, because we believe that we already have adequate laws in place. What gun manufacturers for many years survived off of the notion that the federal government gave them an above the law standard. In other words, I can sue tobacco companies, I can sue opiate companies, I can sue any company internationally or domestically for harming my consumers. Yet the Congress gave a waiver. Basically, gun manufacturers were above the law in terms of liability. Now what the courts are weighing in is that state AGs have a right to defend our community and our people. And what they're saying is that gun manufacturers can be held responsible for their own deceptive marketing and irresponsible practices. So I do think you'll see an increase of liability shifting back to these gun manufacturers.
So do you believe that this will encourage attorneys general in other states, governors, gun control advocates to press on to hold these companies financially responsible? Do you believe that it will open the way for other countries, other governments, to file lawsuits, just like the Mexican government did?
Yes, I do believe that this is the kind of the beginning cracking of the dam, so to speak. Really, every other industry and practice is subject to liability in our marketplace. And I do believe this is the pathway. The Sandy Hook victims did not pass in vain. That really, this courageous litigation is really going to lead, really, I believe, to bringing more justice in the courtrooms across the land.
And according to this Mexican lawsuit that you have signed on to in an amicus brief, these firms have designed and marketed military-style assault weapons to appeal to the cartels and other criminal outfits in Mexico. Colt, the gun maker, for example, quote, according to the lawsuit, does not even try to hide its pandering to the criminal market in Mexico, the government of Mexico alleges. And every year we know about 500,000 guns. Many of them, semi-automatic assault rifles, are illegally trafficked from the United States into Mexico. Mexico now ranks third globally in terms of gun-related deaths, although the country has very strict gun laws. How do you change this dynamic?
Well, and the reason we supported the lawsuit is because, we're not asking that the cartel member that pulls the actual trigger of the weapon, that those gun companies be held liable for that cartel activity. But if a company knowingly markets and floods an entire commerce marketplace that actually bans guns and harms occur in that nation, the gun company should be held responsible for the marketing and flooding of an economy with a very dangerous style weapon.
And it is the Mexican government today. Other governments could file lawsuits against U.S. gun makers in the future for the use of their weapons in the killing of innocent civilians. We know gun-related violence has been increasing in Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, other countries. What happens in the future? Can you foresee a case where lawsuits will be brought against U.S. Weapons makers for the killing of innocent civilians, whether it's in Mexico or any of these countries, or in Yemen or anywhere else where U.S. weapons are being used in a way that kill many, many innocent civilians? Or is that simply too far-fetched?
No, I do think if you look throughout the history of the justice system, it is many times the first wave of defense for an unlawful profiteer or a practice that needs to be banned or prohibited is that they don't get hauled into court. And for many generations, these gun manufacturers could actually keep their cases out of court on these immunity notions that the federal government have provided. So that's what's so historic about this, is that it now at least allows communities to bring these cases into court and not get thrown out. And so I think you'll see an evolution of the history. I'm optimistic. The downside is this litigation takes many years. The Sandy Hook victims were murdered in 2012. And so now we're talking about justice 10 years later. But I'm optimistic and hopeful that you will see an evolution, that the courts have to allow these cases to proceed and at least provide safety interest, an ability to seek justice, and most importantly, hit these companies in the pocketbook. That's what I'm hopeful at some point we can bring these cases to a court of law.
Hector Balderas, New Mexico Attorney General, really grateful to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
The right to bear arms, which is enshrined in the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, is here to stay, no matter how many mass shootings and other firearm deaths the country endures. Republicans and Democrats alike will not fathom the idea of dealing with what has been a constitutional right since 1791 as a national liability, a societal tragedy, let alone a harmful, pernicious gun culture. Inevitably, after each major school shooting, particularly when children fall prey to mass shooters, there's always a fair degree of outcry and lofty pledges. But once the emotions wear off, politicians, and in this case, especially Democratic lawmakers, as they are ideologically the less strident advocates of the Second Amendment, would rather let sleeping dogs lay. Because the next election is always around the corner, even if a slim majority of Americans favor tighter gun ownership regulations. And so, in short, there is little prospect for Democrats to take the bull by the horns. In US politics, this bull is simply too heavy, too stubborn. But the adverse ruling against an iconic gun maker, Remington, may well shake the ground beneath gun advocates and their backers in and around government. But it may be early days for that to happen, all the more that these questions are likely to be ultimately decided by the US Supreme Court, which is, for now and the foreseeable future, solidly in the hands of conservative Republican justices. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri, and the team. Thanks for watching.